Welcome to tonight's event from the New York Technology Council. It should be a great program. For those who don't know us, we're the New York Technology Council. We're a nonprofit. We focus on 4 areas. And it may sound trite, but we wouldn't be here without our sponsors. And thanks to NYU-Poly for this space. We appreciate it. And thanks to Strategist. Appreciate their help in pulling this event together.
So for those of you who have seen me or know me at all, I don't usually sit down in general, but I'm going to for a minute because I want to make sure that I don't skip all of the things that these great people have done, and I am not going to be able to fit it all in. So thank you all for coming to the 3rd installment of our Interactive Marketing Panel Series. As you see, this one is Supercharging Your Business Growth Through Storytelling. So I'm sure a lot of you have noticed that in the last couple of years, marketing and sales has changed in a really seismic way. And traditional advertising has changed completely over the last 10 years or so. It's not effective in the way that it was because of the internet. And digital marketing has stepped in and has filled in the gap. So we've created this series of panels on the different aspects of interactive marketing. And today we're going to be talking about storytelling, which has gotten a huge amount of attention and play over the last 5 or so years. And we want to explore why that is and how you can do it. And we have 3 very different perspectives. In some ways they converge, and I'll be speaking as well. So it's going to be very difficult for me to fit in a description of what these 3 people have done. They've all done a huge amount. They've had very long and varied careers at their stunningly young ages, but we will try. So we've got Michael Roderick. Raise your hand, Michael. So Michael went from being a high school English teacher to a Broadway producer in under 2 years. And he basically used that experience as a platform for the next 17 phases of his career. He created a workshop on networking. He has a very unique perspective on networking. And from there it grew into a full-time consulting practice. And you'll see the lines between networking and marketing just blur and fade away completely where he's involved. And that's why we brought him in today. He uses stories as a very central part of that. He's also worked as a VP of operations and a director of business development for a New York educational tech startup. We've got Jen Begeal. I never asked for the pronunciation of your last name. How do you pronounce it?
It's Begeal.
Begeal, okay. But I am very familiar with her work. She's a digital content strategist who is, her sweet spot is telling branded stories across multiple platforms. She is currently the CEO of JLB Hart Media, and their mission is to build personal connections between brands and their audiences. She was a co-founder of StoryCode. She has worked at Current TV, Verizon, Fios as a digital content producer and strategist, featured writer for Huffington Post, Tribeca Film Festival, contributor for Transmedia Coalition. So we're very happy to have her as well. And we've got Jamie King with us. He got involved with making video games very early, 1996. A year later, he co-founded Rockstar Games behind Grand Theft Auto and a lot of other great properties. He's shifted focus since then to mobile gaming, to UI, UX, monetization, social web design, digital marketing, all kinds of very exciting stuff. He's working under the banner Jamie Inc., which is beautiful in its simplicity. And he currently contracts with a lot of companies, Kiwi Inc., Beyond Gaming, SA Studio Global, Soul and Vibe, Lone Signal. And he's just doing some really amazing, interesting stuff that he'll tell us about tonight. And I've got to talk about myself, of course. I am the founder and principal of Michael Schein Communications. We're a digital marketing company. We are the originators of a process called content casting. And what we do is we arm businesses to create their own online content in a way that turns them into authority so they can generate a steady stream of new business online. And we've worked with companies including eBay, and LinkedIn, and Avectra, Interneer, Tesla Inc., Arise, and Citrix. I'm also the author of a book called Teenage Roadhogs that was published by Macmillan, and I got my start at Pop-Up Video. So without further ado, let's have Michael talk to us for a little bit. And you have no slideshow, so
yeah, exactly. I'm pretty low tech.
basically, one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was this idea of telling a story and helping people to start to move into different levels of adoption in regards to your business. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience when I was very young as a story that will help you think about the way that you're presenting your material to bring in consumers. So it starts back when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. I used to love to go to the corner store, and in the back of the corner store there was this board right by where all the cash registers were, and it was loaded with comic books. And what was really cool was I would go in there, and basically spread out in front of me would be all of these different comic books, and I would look, and I would always try to look through this whole mess of books, and I would just try to find the cover that was the most interesting to me. So I'd look at this whole mess, and then all of a sudden I'd see the cover, and sometimes I'd recognize somebody. So sometimes it was Spider-Man, sometimes it was Superman, sometimes it was Batman, but in other cases, it was more about what was actually happening. What was the story that was being told? What was that initial thing that got me to say, I want to actually open up this comic book? And from the standpoint of the work that you're doing when you're marketing, when you're trying to grow your business, if you imagine the sort of social media landscape as well as your LinkedIn's, your Facebook's, your Pinterest, all those types of things as that big table, you want to think about what is the cover of your comic book? What message are you putting out there that's going to cause somebody to say, I want to turn the page, I want to click through, I want to find out more about this particular experience? Now, the interesting thing about that was I would find a comic book that I was really excited about, I would take that comic book home, and it wasn't until years later that I realized that the comic book industry actually had a really, really brilliant marketing tactic that was embedded within the book itself. So how many of you remember, if you read comic books, the Charles Atlas comic? Anybody? Okay, so the Charles Atlas comic was this little comic that basically showed this guy, and he was getting sand kicked in his face, and he was getting beat up, and the big buff guy sort of took the girl, and then he goes home, and the next panel is him saying, oh, I'm going to order the Charles Atlas system, and you see him sort of exercising a little bit, and then the last panel is this guy totally just kicking butt and kicking sand in the face of the other guy and taking the girl back. And what I found was absolutely fascinating about this was the fact that you're reading a comic book, you're young, you're probably not nearly in the shape of these comic book heroes, and what happens? In that moment of pain, what do you read in the exact same medium that you're currently reading? You read about a way to solve the problem. And this is a mistake that most people in marketing make. They basically look at it from the standpoint of, oh, I'm going to tell you how to do this, you have to do it this way, all these types of things. They don't pay attention to people's worldview. They don't pay attention necessarily to the pain. So if you create that click-through, if you create that thing, that cover for your comic book, and you get people to flip, you get them to go to your website, now they're reading that content. Now they're starting to be in that world. So what's going to happen? You're going to introduce them to or get them to think about what is the pain, what is the challenge that they're experiencing. And the best way to do that is to educate the consumer. So if you start explaining different pain points, then they start saying, hey, that's kind of like me, that's kind of like me. And all of a sudden you put your own little Charles Atlas comic in there. And now they say, well, how can I solve that problem? How can I do that? Oh, I can buy this service. I can use this particular thing. The other thing that I found was really, really fascinating about this particular industry was the idea of the story. So the story, if those of you who remember comic books, or if you didn't read comic books, how many of you watch a serial TV show? How many of you were Breaking Bad fans? Okay? Or Dexter, or any number of these serials. How many people watched Heroes when it first came out? The very first couple of episodes of Heroes. Okay? they were masters. If you want to figure out the best way to write a cliffhanger, the best way to get somebody to be like, wait a second, I want to know what happens, watch an episode of Heroes. Because what they did was they basically gave you just enough to make you say, oh my God, I need to find out the answer. I need to figure out what the problem was. And that was the genius of what so many comic books did. They left something out. They caused us to say, I need to know what happens to Batman next. I need to know what happens to Spider-Man next. So if you are creating content and you're sending these emails out, you want people to read this story that you've created or start to read the information that you've created, and you want them to click through. You want there to be a gap. You want there to be something that they say, oh, I need to find out the rest of that. So you'll see tons of people in the content marketing space are writing these things where there's 2 or 3 points, and then they'll say for the next 3 points, click through. Now the interesting thing about this from a psychological standpoint, if any of you have ever read Cialdini's Influence, there's a really, really important point about the small tacit commitment. If somebody makes a small tacit commitment, they're actually much more likely to make a bigger commitment later on. So if you get somebody to click through a website, they've made now a small tacit commitment. If you get them to put their email address in to get your newsletter, now they've made another commitment. Now they're 3 or 4 steps in of saying yes. When you offer something at that point, they have to go back through the fact that they've said yes 3 times in order to say no. They actually have to physically contradict themselves. And that's what the comic book industry did. When you were reading the series, if you got to the end and you wanted to know what happened to that character, you were already invested in that character. You were like, I can't give up on this particular character, so I have to keep going. And what did that do? It made you buy comic book after comic book after comic book after comic book. It made you watch series after series after series. And that's what we're doing when we're telling these stories from a marketing standpoint in our business. We are creating these miniature comic books. Every time you tweet, it's a miniature comic book cover. If your tweet isn't interesting, we're not reading it. If your message isn't something that makes us go somewhere else, it's pointless. There's no reason to have it out there, other than for somebody to say, oh, well, that's kind of interesting, or that's kind of cute. You want to keep leading people. You want to get them to buy the series. You don't want them to just buy one issue. And that's the way that you want to think about your storytelling. Now, what did I just do? I just taught everybody something using a story. One of the most effective tools that I learned, I was a high school English teacher for 8 years. One of the most effective tools that I learned as a teacher is something called indirect instruction. Indirect instruction is when you have a conversation about one particular thing, and the students follow along and they listen and they sort of go through that entire process, and at the end they realize they learned about something that they didn't realize they had learned about. So in this story of comic books, you just learned more about content marketing. Thanks.
All right, great. All right, Jen. Leah, let's get you started.
Yeah. While he's setting up, who here owns a business? Raise your hands. Who here wants to reach more clients and get more customers? Okay, it should be everybody in the room, because that's why we're here, right? So I'm going to give everybody today a little show and tell about storytelling mechanics. And so we're going to go next slide. So what does story mean? Now we all know what stories are. They're narratives that are shared across every culture as a means of entertainment, education, and preservation. They instill moral values. And when you tell your company's brand story, or company or brand story, you have to think in terms of storytelling and think of the overall narrative, including the history of your company, your marketing objectives, your executive background, your service, and your product. So next slide. So what makes a good story? This is actually one of my favorite quotes by one of my favorite authors, John Steinbeck. He says, if a story is not about the hearer, he or she will not listen. A great lasting story is about everyone, or it will not last. The strange and foreign is not interesting, only the deeply personal and familiar. And basically what he's saying, and what we're saying in marketing, is make your story resonate with your audience and one that they can identify with. Next slide. So how do you tell your story? Well, first you have to ask yourself a few questions. These questions are, who is my audience? Where do they spend their time? Why should they care about my company or my product? And what am I providing for them? So you want to know your audience. Now, who here remembers this movie? Okay. As the case in The Princess Bride, the grandfather, played by Peter Falk, knows that his grandson, played by Fred Savage, will understand and enjoy the book that he brings to him, The Princess Bride. He knows or assumes and understands that assuming that part of knowing your audience is based on assumption. You're starting a business, so you've done your research, you know who your audience is generally going to be. So he assumes that 10-year-old boys will like books about pirates, fencing, princesses, and evil princes. Next slide. The next question you want to ask is, what are your audience's habits? Where do they hang out? Where do they spend their time? Are they on Facebook? Are they on Twitter? Do they watch TV? Do they watch web series? Where are you going to be able to reach your audience? And you're going to have to develop your content or your story for wherever your audience exists. Next is make your story accessible. Making a story accessible means making it understandable by the majority of your audience. There are 7 archetypal themes that recur in every kind of storytelling. Using one of these themes, or a mix of them, makes your brand's message easily digestible by your audience. These 7 archetypes are overcoming the monster, as in Beowulf, rebirth, like in It's a Wonderful Life, quest, like Lord of the Rings, journey and return, for instance, Where the Wild Things Are, rags to riches, the Cinderella story, tragedy, like you find in today's PSAs, or comedy, like Old Spice's Man's Man. Stories convey meaning and are symbolic of the world around us. Use too many symbols and the meaning is distorted. Next slide. And that leads us to spreadable. Now, many people confuse spreadable with viral. Viral is non-active participation. Spreadable requires action on the part of your audience. If your audience is in love with your story, they will spread it. And lastly, stay positive. This is something it took me years to learn, and one I now convey to all of my clients. Positive messaging is very important to both spreadability and brand trust. Never use a negative message to try and sell your brand. Think in terms of politics. Everybody voted yesterday, I hope. Would you rather vote for a candidate who spoke only negatively about their opposition, or one that spoke positively about what they were going to do for you, for the community, for the office in general? Keep this always in mind when you're telling your own story, is don't think in terms of negative. No matter how bad a day you're having, try to always look at the positive side. And lastly, measure your results, and do it often. I generally measure my results at least once a month, taking a look at the analytics. You want to do this to make sure that you're on track with your audience, that you're telling the proper story, and if it's not working, go back to the drawing board. Start again, or just change your messaging. Next. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a case study on a project that I worked on. It's easier to show than just to tell a story. So the project was called The Last Crop. It's a documentary film about sustainable agriculture and land easements. My challenge was to create a large audience and build awareness around the actual project, the film itself, before we ran an Indiegogo campaign for crowdfunding. So what I had to do was do a lot of research. I had to find out who my audience was and what my story was. My audience was generally farmers, people who owned co-ops, CSAs, and my story was overcoming the monster. And the monster was corporations who were buying up land. They were making land unaffordable for small farmers. And what it was doing is it was squeezing out the family farm business. And we were building this film and building this audience to tell people about what land grabbing was and to take back the land, essentially. In doing so, we built our community. To date, we have over 9,000 fans. And this was done over a course of 6 months, and from ground up. We set out to build the community not only to appreciate the story and watch the film when it was finished, but also to help us raise the finishing funds for the completion of the film. Tell a good story. We started the campaign by telling a story about the farmers that the film was about, and about what was happening to farmland across the country. And if you can see it, this is a post, actually this is an image taken from the film, and we used a statistic from the film called it says 1 million acres of farmland is lost each year. We had 29 shares, 2,041 people saw the post. Now, it's not a huge number when you think overall, but in terms of the fact that this is a small independent film with no budget, these are pretty decent numbers. And then we wanted to make it spreadable. So the image, again, we wanted to keep the message simple so that people could share this message and understand where we were coming from. And again, we had several shares, and the one on the right, this is where we learned our entire audience are alcoholics. It says wheat makes beer, corn makes whiskey, grapes make wine, and it keeps going. You can't get drunk without farmers. You're welcome. We had 763 shares to date on that alone. And again, we understood who our audience was, and we knew what story we were telling them, and we knew that if we gave them something that they could latch onto, they would share it. Next. Going back to my idea of make it positive. Sometimes we're posting images. They don't have to do anything with farming, but it could be just an image of nature that has a positive message to it. Again, it's shareable. People want to talk about it. People want to be happy. And if you're telling a good story that makes people smile at the end of the day, you can even tell a scary story that will make people smile at the end of the day. You're doing your job right. And next slide. So to date, we reached over 9,000 engaged Facebook fans over the course of 6 months. 6 months on a budget of $600 in advertising. We had over 800 Twitter followers, and we raised $56,000 during a crowdfunding campaign of 45 days. Throughout the campaign, we made changes to our messaging based upon our audience and their needs and wants. Our demographic, our partnerships, and our outreach campaign were all a part of telling the story and reaching the audience. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Jamie. Historically, I've come from a product development and creating content side. Obviously, I've had a lot of experience making interactive content in video games. For a number of years now, I've been more on the startup side, and also one of the things that are affecting our industry, aside from the big blockbusters, is the notion that games have become commoditized. We're increasingly giving away our games for free. So then we now have the issue that I think a number of companies and industries are facing, which is conversion, and the whole concept of funnel and bringing people into the funnel and retaining them and converting them, and that actually leading to a sale. And so that has then taken me to have a greater focus on marketing and how do we communicate and reach our audience with the kind of engagement that actually triggers a sale. The social web has changed everything. Right? Now, social media has taken over the web. Visual content is taking over social media. As brands, we're told we need to create content and stories, short content for Twitter, longer content for blogs, 8-second videos on Vine, 15 seconds on Instagram, 3-minute videos for YouTube, radio shows, podcasts, embedded posts, you name it. Now, the good thing is that whereas people don't have 30 seconds to be interrupted, certainly not in New York, they do have 3 minutes to hear a great story. And from a brand perspective, interactive storytelling is not about what you sell, it is about conveying what you stand for. So whether it's discovering, revitalizing unknown content, creating and publishing new content, today we must engage and interact with our audience with a two-way conversation. It's no longer just a billboard up on a wall, it is now a dialogue at any moment in time and at multiple brand points. We're also told that we have to share content that connects on an emotional level and is imminently shareable, whilst at the same time it's enhancing our business and telling a story that's truly our own. How do we tell a story? So with the growth of interactive, we have more ways than ever, right? Brand websites, microsites, social networking sites, mobile games, virtual worlds. We know we need to create dynamic multimedia experiences that immerse the audience in brand narratives, drive some kind of meaningful action. So firstly, we have to really understand our audience, right? Who our target customers are, to understand the format to use. And I appreciate these are sweeping statements, right? We all have to, understand the target customer. The content we need to create has to be real, humanized, and relatable. And I think, it's just a very good example of a story where we can bring a message to life in a compelling way by giving context and adding dramatic action and making it relatable. Context and relevance. Who's in the story? Where does the story happen? What happens in the story? How does it end? These elements are vital to creating a clear context that makes a brand message relevant to customers. It's the same for us in video games. In terms of digital and short time span, avoid the intro and the preamble. Take the audience to an immediate instance and get right to the point. Now, this is going back a few years, but if you look at Singular Wireless, right, and their Fewer Dropped Calls campaign, they used humorous stories showing the impact of dropped calls in everyday life. People found the message so relevant, they created their own versions and posted them on YouTube. They made spoofs. And this then gets a little bit into further on in terms of how you're giving control of your brand over to your audience. So we know we have to appeal to emotions and intellect. The story appeals to our emotional and rational sides at the same time, and therefore boosts the message's persuasive impact. It's the difference between memorizing facts, let's say about the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, or watching HBO's special Pacific. I think saying where you said that your students were able to relate and understand and probably comprehend far more information with the story than just facts. It's the same for us in MMO games, right? Where you have 8-year-olds who know more about what a troubadour does and the damage it can wreak on a 16th century castle, than from reading a book, right? She got that from Age of Empires. When you're going for emotions, don't waste time with trivial pursuits, right? Focus on social norms, family, debt, honor, right? Life and death situations, big stakes. It's amazing. I know that we all focus on 18 to 49-year-olds, but it's always sort of resonated with me that tweens, if you look at the most popular literature for tweens, are able and have an appetite for grasping big concepts like divorce and death. So we need to make the abstract tangible, right? It's becoming increasingly difficult for our brand differentiations are becoming more and more abstract. What's the difference between Verizon and Sprint and my O's on each device, right? So we have to help illustrate concepts in concrete ways. So again, if you look at when AT&T acquired Singular Wireless, and I think now Verizon use it, they ran a campaign to promote the concept of the largest network with more bars in more places. You understood it immediately. Kill the content. Now this ties into a little bit of, okay, we're constantly bombarded as brands where we've got to tell stories, we've got to tell engaging stories, they've got to be interactive, they've got to be meaningful, I've got to understand my audience, I've got all of these platforms. And it's in order to keep up with the content demands, most of our results are mediocre, and there's a lot of junk in there too, right? It's very hard for us as a brand to keep producing quality content that matches certainly the quantity. So there's a very interesting argument to step back, just take a deep breath, take a time out, and actually reduce the amount of content. You really need to focus on the true end value that your stories are giving. Right? So don't obsess over your content calendar or get more staff and tell yourself tweet more, blog more. Just take time and ask yourself a very important question. What great stories can we tell? There's a difference between telling a story worthy of being told and a story just to sort of sell something. And that's where I think what we're really seeing now is we can't just tell a story from a billboard. Aside from the mega blockbusters, you can't just put a product on a disc and ship it and the consumer finds out when they get home that it's no good. It is now very much a two-way story. So, the exact story you tell is going to depend on your specific brand attributes, the messages, your targeted customers. But right now, and you can see it everywhere, there are two common types of brand stories. Our history, and here I've picked, Mini USA. So if your brand has been around for a while, share your history. You can now share facts in an emotional context of nostalgia or credibility. And I read a very interesting article that pointed me to Mini USA about how they've threaded a tale of addressing post-World War II gasoline dilemmas, through innovation and becoming a cultural phenomenon into their description of specifications and features, which ties back into what you were saying. Hershey's, believe it or not, another good example. It's a minor example, right? So on their website, it all started with a decision. Great title. They are talking about their history, their founders' history, and they've reinforced it at their headquarters with a museum attraction that features these histories. Now, Cathay Pacific at the moment are running an interesting story on LinkedIn, which just is a contemporary one, and they've got their stewardesses, their pilots, and they're talking, and it, for me, was an example of interactivity, I suppose, was this stewardess was talking about how she got into the business, and she had obviously contributed a blog where there was an article on her. Then, this one that I read on LinkedIn was talking about the fact that a 5-year-old had written a letter in saying, I know who you are, you're the girl who spills drinks on people, because she'd mentioned it. And so they were sort of reinforcing and following up with subsequent stories. For me, that was, I suppose, an example of interactive storytelling. So, I like this image. I put this image for your team. I don't know if all your staff members dress like this, but so no matter what you're selling, no matter what your budget is, you have a really interesting resource available to you, and that's the people that work for you. Now, then we could do a whole other conversation about word of mouth and the importance of word of mouth. It's a great marketing campaign when you have very little money. That then comes back to the very heart of word of mouth, is it emanates and starts from your company, which goes all the way back to, can you define a manifesto for who you are, that all of your staff can speak fluidly and verbatim, pretty much. And then from that, the people who work for you are able to give you word of mouth and are able to tell very interesting, engaging stories with passion that resonate and will connect with your audience. Now, Apple iPhone, very good, right? They showcase real users, right? Explaining a situation in which the iPhone saved the day. They had a great one with a pilot, right? And through his mobile phone, going to check up on the weather, he avoided a 3-hour flight. You have degrees and ranges in which you can let your customers tell stories. That does start really becoming interactive. Right? They may not always tell the story you want, right? But you can at least help guide them and sort of have them talking about topics. St. Regis hotels, right? Invited families to enjoy activities together and blog about it. They took 4 lifestyle bloggers, threw them to properties, had them chronicle their experience on Instagram and their own blogging website. People love to share their own story, right? Look at My 4 Words campaign launched by UBC Pharma, right? It's not easy for a pharmaceutical company to look cool in social media, tons of regulation, medicine's not really very approachable. They focused on their customers and they asked them to share 4 words about their personal journey, battling disease and staying healthy. Brilliant. I'm hearing a lot of conversations and I'm seeing a lot of dialogue about embedded posts. Now, because the lines of social engagement are becoming blurred, especially with now the capability of embedded social posts, right? From what I'm being told, right, they enhance your inbound marketing reach and your storytelling ability. Right? You're increasing your reach by bringing the post to the attention of potential new audience, right? You're ensuring your messages aren't lost or overlooked because you're relying on someone looking at their feed at a certain moment in time. And an example would be, and if I was good, any good at it, I would have been tweeting and blogging about my journey to this event whilst we're here at the event, and then what happened after, and putting it in an embedded post. So what's the future of storytelling and interactive storytelling in terms of digital and marketing? Well, we could definitely now think about crafting experiences that seamlessly blend from the physical to the digital environments, from web and mobile to in-store and in venue. Right? Future storytelling is going to embrace the entire experience space, emotional, physical, and the digital. Take advantage of geolocation technologies. Great company, Second Story. They're using emerging technologies to embed interactivity in physical objects and environments. They're empowering their audience to connect and share in a deeper, more meaningful way. Don't forget search engines. They're your forgotten audience. Yes, humans are our targets, but you need to think about, you need visibility, you need plus engagement, gives you relationships. Relationships will translate to sales. So without search engines, you lack the visibility to necessarily to even begin building relationships. So think about your CEO content strategy, the technical elements, the linking elements, the right content in the right way. You need keyword-rich content that remains in the good graces of search engines. Think about, from all the interactive storytelling content you're using, that the keywords are reflective of that for your SOE. Make sure you include clear title tags, right, containing the keywords, and again, supporting your central message. This way you can start to foster engagement through social, be aware, you're sharing content, you're having conversations, you're listening, you're starting to work out how to get yourself. So, got to get your audience online. Visibility is how your brand is represented online, how you're seen, how you're made available, noticeable, discoverable, big problem in North America, certainly for apps and for games, and that your message and your brand is clear. Once your channels are being trafficked, what do your visitors do? Where do you want to take, what do you want them to take away from the experience? What do you want them to investigate further? How do you ensure they stick around? Strong content, strong stories. What is strong content? It's content that adds value to and captivates your audience while facilitating an authentic and honest two-way dialogue, true engagement, great storytelling. That will lead to relationships, will lead to sales. We're good on time.
We probably have a minute or two, yeah. You good?
Yeah, I mean, I could waffle for hours.
I was just.
Well,
we're all going to talk a little, and that was fascinating stuff, all you guys. So I'm going to take the time to, talk to everybody for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion, up here a little bit, and then we really want to spend a bunch of time to open it up to everyone there. So, how many of you think that Timothy Dalton was the best James Bond? Show of hands.
Go on then.
All right.
I know him, so.
Okay, a little harder. Daniel Craig. Anyone? Maybe? Best? Oh, look at that. Brave souls, brave souls. Oh, look, he likes them both.
Have a fight about James Bond.
Okay, Sean Connery. Okay, all right. How did I know? James Bond, one of the most successful series of all time, right? And the first installment was the movie Dr. No. It was done on a very low budget. It led to, 30, I guess, sequels we're on now. An entire genre was created. And if you've seen the movie, has anyone here seen the movie? Yeah? Okay. There were all kinds of intrigue and in and outs and all the stuff that James Bond has. But the basic story was a little bit like this. So the Western world, is basically threatened by the hideous Dr. No, member of whatever, the Society of Horrible People, Spectre, or whatever it's called. And he lives in this underground cavern on a remote island, right? So James Bond, the hero, is called to travel halfway across the world and defeat him. But before he does, he makes a stop. And does anyone remember what he always does before he does the big battle at the end? He visits somebody, right? He visits Q. And he's armed with all kinds of high-tech devices that are almost magic. it because we've never seen anything like them before. And I actually had a quote, my first slide, explosive alarm clock. Guaranteed, it would sound better if he were doing it, but I'm going to do it.
Do you want me to do
Do you want to? Yeah, that'd be good.
This is what interactive stories are. Explosive alarm clock, guaranteed never to wake up anyone who uses it. Detonate toothpaste, we use sparingly, the latest in plastic explosive.
Thank you. That was, all right. So, so when a story is this successful, because again, we're here for a reason. Storytelling has become this hot topic in marketing, and we'll talk about why. It's largely due to the internet, and we'll talk about that. But it's worth looking at successful stories to see why they're successful, right? So, I mean, one theory of why James Bond is so successful, it was released at the height of the jet age. It was, Sean Connery. It was flashy. It was all of this stuff. But there is another possible reasons. Those are the details. That's the meat on the bones of the story. And Jen spoke about it. So the very first story that we have in writing is Gilgamesh, right? And it's a Sumerian story, and it's about a hero who is called upon to save the world, his world, whatever. It was probably like the size of Iraq at the time, but that was his world. And to travel to a distant land. And before he went there to defeat this monster, he was armed by a wizard guru who gave him magical armor and a sword, which he then used to go fight the final battle with the monster, almost died, defeats the monster, and then saves the world, overcoming the monster, one of the 7 story structures. Beowulf, Jaws has this same story structure, Dr. No, Apple. The PC. Now, I know you said don't get negative, and I agree to an extent, but negativity, I would argue, when done properly, it can be horrible. But when done properly, works very well. The PC Apple ads, who was the monster?
IBM.
Right, the PC. But it's worth, what we're going to talk about, was Apple really a hero? I don't think so. And we're going to talk about that. So, it's worth it. There's been a lot of research done. We are wired for story. And I want to say we're literally wired for story, but we don't actually have wires hanging out of our brain. But we have neural pathways that respond to certain story structures. And some people say evolution, some people say it's more mystical, but that is the truth. And there are 7 basic story structures. Okay, overcoming the monster is one of them, and that's an effective one. I would argue that in the Apple case, Apple was not James Bond. I would argue that Apple was Q. Your customer should be James Bond, right? So we are all heroes in our own story, all of us. The kid reading the comic book is the hero in the story, right? I mean, so you want, the more you can make your customer feel like a hero, the better you'll do. And you need to be the person with the magic, with the tools, with the special stuff that allows them to accomplish their goals and overcome adversity. And so, so what does this have to do with digital marketing? And everyone has referred to the digital space. Everyone has referred to content. And I think Jamie had a great point. There's just so much content out there, right? And, I would argue that when done properly, you do need a lot of content in that it is what search engines like, it is what builds an audience. But people are just throwing content out there without any rhyme or reason, without any story. And they're killing themselves, they're killing their brand. So if you think about how the internet actually works, and this has been referred to, in the past, you were dependent on interruptions. And you spoke about interruptions, how people don't have 30 seconds in New York, right? But in the past, I'm 36 years old. Some would say that's old, some would say it isn't. But we bought our encyclopedias from a door-to-door salesperson. I mean, that feels like the dark ages. That feels like the 1940s to me. Is that the dark ages? I don't think so. But, that feels like many, many years ago. So, but it wasn't, because the only way you could find out about products or services was to be interrupted. So people tolerated it. Today, people go online and search, and those that aren't are doing it more and more. I mean, my grandmother is the biggest user of Facebook that I know, and that is not a cliche. That is actually a true statement. So now when you interrupt people, you're annoying them. They resent it. So essentially, success means providing content that people actually want for its own sake, not just because it's pitching them in a clever, persuasive, manipulative way. It's stuff that distinguishes your point of view from everyone else's, but it's content that people actually want. And, success means stories, because we are wired for these stories. So it's important to lay out that series of content in a way that walks them through a journey. Now, this is, for two things about this. This is not a secret. There's even a term for it, content marketing. Everyone is talking about it. And it's also hard. Everyone comes to these seminars and they learn all this stuff about storytelling and this and that. And what does that mean? Tell a story, lay out my content, to create a story. It's difficult stuff. Well, the first thing is, and companies go wrong in one of two ways. Number one, they produce haphazard content. Oh, we've got a blog, everyone's doing the blogging thing, social media, the blog. So they start blogging and they're throwing posts out there. And then they wonder why they're not getting business, so they double the blogging, right? They do 2 a day. But just blogging, it's useless. If you're not walking people through a journey where you're showing them that what your ideas are, and the ideas that your products and services happen to typify, but that your ideas and the way you see the world and the tips you give them don't allow them to become the hero in their story and then overcome obstacles and get to their goals. If you don't become the cue in your content, it doesn't work. And the second thing is, a lot of companies they're a little more sophisticated. They use the content calendar, they have clever kind of stuff, but their story's all about me. It's hilarious. I will hear people talk about storytelling all day long, and you'll hear companies like, we gotta start telling stories. I got a story for you about why our bleach gets your shirts the cleanest. Let's have people do it in a story form. Well, it doesn't matter if you have commercials that look like sitcoms instead of commercials. That is not storytelling. Storytelling is about releasing a series of, let's use the word content, that allows people, changes their mind about what the answers that are out there are. Once you've done that, give them actionable tips that allows them to actually make things happen in their own careers in life. And then, only then, can you start selling them. And that's the story. That is storytelling. I would argue that behind all of it is that. So how do you do it? Let's get back to that. Hard stuff, but the good news is, and everyone up here talked about this a little bit, there really is no need to be original. When James Bond came out, I'm interested in this kind of stuff, so I checked out. There were clips at the premiere. People thought this was the most creative thing they had ever seen, with the exploding bubble gum and the English guy, and the whole deal. But it was Gilgamesh. It was Beowulf. These structures are out there. The place to get creative is not with the storytelling structures. It's with the ideas that you hang on top of them. And you guys have the ideas, or else you wouldn't be sitting in that room. But what you might not have is the structures. Steal the structures. The other thing, back to this, and we can talk about this in our Q&A a little bit. I would say it's not a good idea to be negative in terms of bashing people. But I do think it's very useful, especially if you use the overcoming the monster structure, which is one of the best ones out there. And this stuff is available in all kinds of books, what these structures are, or just by watching movies. But I would create an external enemy. What does that mean? Well, it might be a product, PC, but it might be a concept. So there is a guy named Leo Balbana. He has a site called Zen Habits. Does anyone know it? Okay. Well, it's a blog, and it became a company, self-help. He sells all kinds of videos and books, makes a lot of money now. And what he did, though, he basically created an external enemy out of the other kind of self-help books out there. So, self-help falls into one of two camps. On one hand, it's the discipline, right? It's, you've got to be strong. If you're not concentrating, if you can't focus, concentrate harder. Walk over hot coals, right? That's the one camp. And the other camp is, put it out into the universe and it will come back to you. That's all you need, right? What he said was it's neither of those two things. And he constantly drummed that into your head. He said those things are ridiculous, right? He said it's about habit building. It's about starting slow, focusing on one habit at a time, systematic methods, more of a Ben Franklin-ish type approach. But he created this kind of cult of people by creating this external enemy. Created a monster, right? And he slew the monster. So it's important to keep in mind, I mean, just to sum it up, people want to be James Bond. I mentioned that already. In whatever storytelling strategy you use, online or off, but online should be part of it, because if you're not doing that, the world's going to catch up with you fast. But I'm sure since you're at a digital marketing seminar, you're very open to that. But position your customer as James Bond, as the hero. Find out what their goals are. Find out what they want really badly. Find out what pain they're trying to avoid. And then position yourself as that funny British guy who has all the tools to make it happen. And you'll be surprised by how quickly your audience grows. And from there, how much business you'll get as a result. So, with that, let's ask a few questions. Let's have a bit of a discussion. So I want to start just by talking about everyone's experience a little bit, because everyone, I think, without exception on this panel, and this is not always the case, has had a lot of experience in different fields. And they're kind of related, but kind of not at all. And so I would just like to hear from everybody about how the ability to tell stories has helped facilitate this. Because yeah, we're all here to hear about marketing, but versatility is such a big part of success and in marketing yourself in today's environment. I'd love to hear how you've all used stories to sort of make those transitions on this.
So if I understand your question right, how I've used storytelling for myself, in my experiences?
Yeah, just in your you've done a lot of things. You went from video games to marketing. You've made these sort of seamless transitions, and obviously that's a skill you believe in. So I wonder how you've applied it to make the transitions a little bit doable.
I don't know how I'd apply storytelling to transit. Well, I suppose doing startups and raising money, and you made a really good comment about problems and solution. And in terms of when you think about your product and designing a product and what's the core experience, you need to sort of look at it in terms of what is the problem and what is your solution. And then we're sort of led to, encouraged to think that my unique value proposition, right, which is from in the film industry the same as my elevator pitch, my 25 words that is explaining, and maybe explaining is not the right word, how I'm solving your problems, without necessarily talking about the features. Right? And rather than sort of describing the features, I'm sort of letting you know how I'm solving your problems. So I suppose, the art of storytelling has definitely played a very strong role in, from making video games that are heavily story-driven to then pitching and raising money for a startup, to then defining that, sort of unique value proposition, which, so that we understand what we're building, and then we also understand what we're selling.
Great, perfect, yeah. And can you all hear me, so I don't have to keep taking the mic? Can I ask questions from here? Does that work? Yeah. Okay.
All right. So I guess how I've used storytelling to sell myself, I guess is what.
Sell yourself. You can certainly take the question that way.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, in terms of what I've done in my career is as I've moved from from working in a corporate environment to having my own company. I tell the stories about the projects that I'm working on. It's a way to sell myself. For instance, I gave the case study of the project I was on, the last crop. It's being able to tell my client's story is a way to actually be able to sell what I do, and to be able to enhance, to move my career forward. I work in storytelling, so I tell the story of the brand or the client, as a way to pitch them, as a way to pitch myself, as a way to get people to understand how how marketing works, how how digital advertising works, and how story ties everything together. So I guess that's the best way for me to explain it. Is,
Yeah.
So I guess the way that I would approach this is in essence, I use other people's stories. And what I mean by that is every person that I meet, I ask them their origin story, because that's usually the most interesting area, but it's also actually the most fertile ground for figuring out who to connect them to. So if you ask somebody where they started, and you ask them how they got to their career path, sort of what they've done, you find out where they went to school, you find out often if they have a family, you find out a number of aspects of them that are beyond the professional. And what I find is that when you're doing the most effective connecting, you're figuring out things that are going to affect them outside of that professional environment. So when people tell me that origin story, I take very, very careful notes. And then when I'm thinking of who I want to connect them to, many times it's a situation in which that person is at a particular level and they want an introduction to somebody at a higher level. So sometimes there's a lot of friction there. There's somebody who, they invest in projects and they're saying, oh, you know what, why would I talk to another startup founder? Well, you're both dog lovers. You're both single dads. I think you guys would really get along. And many times that breaks that barrier down. So a lot of the time what I find is that if you find out people's personal stories and you really build that into your selling of those people, or sort of putting those people together, you actually become a much more effective connector. And I think that that's something that is often missed. We often say, well, I'll make this introduction, but we don't take the time to say, well, why is this introduction going to be valuable for both sides? So I use other people's stories as a way to as a way to make those connections more smooth.
Oh, great. So, we have a lot of small business owners, a lot of startups, a lot of executives in growing companies. So, what are some tips that all of you might be able to give, if it applies to you, of course, to, companies on a somewhat limited budget, whether really limited or relatively limited, and in ways they could use storytelling to grow, to sort of overcome that obstacle and grow their business?
Sure. Tell the story from the standpoint of the why you're doing it, as opposed to what you're doing. And many of you, I'm sure, have seen the Simon Sinek TED Talk about this sort of start with why concept. But I think it's so important to let people know what is the passion behind what you're doing. And I've raised money for Broadway shows, and I've had, I've had shows that have been incredibly challenging pieces to raise money for. But the way that I raised money for them was I talked about why I was doing it. So one of the shows I did was Scottsboro Boys, and that was a piece that was not commercial. But what I said to anybody who was investing in that show, I said, I'm an educator, and this show educates. So if you want to be a part of history, if you want to be part of education and musical theater history, this is the project for you. And I think if you come from that emotional place, you talk to people about why you're doing this, you've got a much better chance of connecting with them and making your story be heard.
And to interrupt for a second, would you also say it's important to connect with why they're doing it? I noticed you said why I'm doing it, I'm an educator, but how would you draw that distinction between I'm an educator and why they care about education?
Yeah, I think that, and I'm sure people can hear me because I'm pretty loud, I think that if you've taken the time to get to know them already, then you can thread that information in. So if it was another educator, then I was talking to them from that standpoint. I was saying, I'm an educator, you're an educator, this is where we sort of have the commonality. But if it was somebody who's just been really passionate about musical theater, I would say, listen, you've been involved in these 3 shows in the musical theater space. This could be a great part of the canon for you. This could be something that you could talk to more people about and really look at the ways that it's going to benefit them.
And Jen, before you answer if this is applicable, if you could expand that, because that's so great conceptually, to how that works in the digital space on a sort of mass scale, because I know that's your sweet spot.
I guess I'm a little bit confused by the.
So if you don't have a lot of money, you know,
Yeah,
if you don't have a lot of money, we're saying how can you use storytelling to go now? Michael talked about
How do you tell a cohesive story?
or how do you use some of these storytelling techniques? I mean, we all know, you know, how to use advertising. I mean, that was the old thing. Put an ad in the classifieds, but how do you get online and use some of these storytelling techniques to do it on the cheap?
Okay. Well, first and foremost, and this is, you know, we go back to the content marketing, is build a roadmap. You know, one of the things that I've gotten really good at is actually writing content strategies, and what a content strategy is it's a roadmap, and it helps you see, you know, in a document form, what your digital space looks like. And when I do my strategy, I do website, social media, market research, you know, what the competition is doing, where they're, and you know, another big thing is where are your potential partners, where are, you know, your mouthpieces, you know, who are the people out there that are going to support your brand and support your company, and how do you get them to talk about you? And that all kind of goes into this, you know, this idea of this overall roadmap, because, you know, it's one thing to just have a Facebook page. It's another, you know, it's one thing to just have a blog, or, you know, or to have all of them, but if they're not connecting and they're not talking to each other and they're not cohesive, and that's really the thing I want to stress the most, is have that cohesive story. Once you understand what your story is, you understand who your audience is, you understand what story you're telling them, then you make it cohesive, and that comes back to you talking about SEO. You know, when you're using those keywords, it makes you searchable. When somebody plugs in, you know, for instance, social media marketer, you know, I mean, everybody, you know, all these social media marketing, you know, websites come up, but if they type in social media marketer New York, well, then it, you know, it filters down again. You want to make sure that you're cohesive, that you've got the right content coming together. And you can do this all on your own. I mean, this is not rocket science. This is basic, solid principles of just linking things together. And you know, when you start with a story, you know, every great story starts with a once upon a time, or you know, an opening line, and the story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's what your story should have. And when you're telling the story across your platforms, keep that same story in mind, and you know, and you'll be able to then be searchable. People will find you, and you know, you'll get out there. You'll get this, and it's not going to cost you a fortune. It's going to be something simple that you can do yourself. There you go.
So anyone
Good job.
steal the
Just
mic.
go. Just go. No, take it.
I helped a startup recently called Loan Signal launch, and we had no money. And you can literally, with Loan Signal, and the service is still running, you can send a text message to outer space, to destination 17 light years away, and write a text message to an extra intelligence. And we had a lot of real-world engineering problems. We used a NASA satellite dish. We had no money, I mean, like $0. So we learned a lot about building up the Twitter following. The only advice I could give to you is you start following people that are interesting, and every week you review and you cut back a number that don't follow you back. And in your first 2 weeks, you're going to be following more people than follow you. But the trick is you want to have more followers than people you're following. So you do the step program. When you follow a number of people, they should follow you back. Those that don't, you cut them out. You slowly build up until you have more followers. Then obviously you have Facebook. We would run, and I'm sort of thinking about all the things we got no money. Joke of the day. We would start referencing and tying into bigger brands that had budgets, NASA Social, celebrating events that we thought were interesting in history that were relevant to what we would do. And piggybacking off historical events, bigger brands, wider activities that are online where you could sort of start crawling your way up into getting visibility. There's an organization called wordofmouth.org. Subscribe to it. It's awesome because it's all about you, your company, your super fans, right? Your super connectors. Start with your brand ambassadors, which are your interns answering the phone, going home and talk to their parents about how much they love working at the company, right? So then anyone at Starbucks and meeting someone. And it educates and talks to you all about how to look at your audience as a community and how to engage them. And a lot of what they talk about doesn't cost money. And that's free marketing. And it also then helps sort of show you how to think about applying ways of using Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, you know, and you do only have your stories, your history, your stuff. And that is great free marketing.
By the way, that Twitter tip, just as a practical tip, is a great tip.
Yeah, no, I was like,
Yeah.
okay, that's awesome. And then there's something about putting a period sign either before the @ sign.
Before.
Can you explain that one?
So,
Because you don't always read this one, right?
no. If you use just the @ sign, like if you just use somebody's Twitter handle and start the conversation, what will happen is that only shows up on their actual Twitter feed because you're talking directly at that person, and it will show up on their feed. If you want to rope them into the conversation, you put the period before the
And is it like period, no space?
no
and
period, no space. So it's
and
like
then that
period,
will-
and then the @ and then that
brings
but that
in
just
their audience,
tags
right?
them. It brings in their audience and your audience and the audience.
You learn something new every day.
Right.
Yeah.
So you start twittering someone who's got millions of followers.
But you know what? I disagree with you on the followers thing, though. I disagree
Okay.
with you because for me, I've noticed it's not really about the number. I mean, the number of people that you follow versus your followers. I find that we still get followers like for our Twitter campaign for the last crop. Like we're following way more people that are following us, and the reason we're doing it is because they don't necessarily. We're following CSAs and co-ops. They have maybe one intern that does their tweeting once blue moon. But we want to follow them because we're interested in what they're talking about. And we're interested in retweeting them because they are a part of our community and we want people to actually follow them and be a part of it. So we're taking their content. I want to know that they're on board. I want to know what their content is.
So you're being a super fan.
So I'm being a super fan, yes.
So the orgs.
To the orgs.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so since we are running somewhat short of time, I'm gonna keep that, and I do want to open it up to the audience. So, does anyone have a question?
Don't be shy, we don't bite.
Oh, want to bet.
He does.
All right, let's pass the mic around a little bit.
Yeah.
You know.
So, unlike a lot of people in this room, I own a company that's been in business for 30 some odd years and really developed this particular little niche in software. And I'm sure that my associates have lots of stories. I wasn't with the company for all of that 30-year period. So the company is 30 years old, originated this particular little software niche. Are old stories good stories, or do they have to be new? What makes a good story?
So basically, for anyone who didn't hear it, this gentleman's company is 30 years old. And he was asking the question, are old stories good stories, or do they have to be new? So I'll just open that up to the, who wants to take that first?
I mean, they're great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, we go back to the seven archetypes. Basically, any story you ever tell will fall into one of the 7 archetypes, and those stories are as old as mankind. So old stories are new stories. New stories are old stories. It doesn't matter where the story came from. It doesn't matter how old the story is. I mean, we're still re-upping Shakespeare. We're still re-upping, Pride and Prejudice and Emma and Jane Austen, novels. And so every time you turn around, we're taking old stories and retelling them.
This is a great question.
Yeah.
Sure. I think that regardless of the age of the story, it's what's the impact. So when you think about the different stories and you think about the stories that have been told, it's like, okay, which of those stories caused people to really respond in just talk to your company. So if you look at those stories and you say, oh, that story was great, you may go back and tweak it a little bit, do something, or just retell it. Because if it had that impact, chances are the impact doesn't go away. And a perfect example of that, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Medium, but I've had instances where I've taken content that I wrote like 4 years ago and just reposted it. And all of a sudden it's gotten like way more response now than it did 4 years ago. So I think just look at the impact.
Yeah, I had that, it just happened now. I was talking about, I work in transmedia storytelling, and a couple of years ago I went to a conference, and at the conference I noticed that there were a lot of women at the conference. Like, women are really getting into they're in the social media sphere, they're in the digital storytelling sphere, there's a lot of girls. And so I wrote a whole article on where the girls are, where the transmedia girls are. And this was 2 years old, and I reposted it today, and it got reshared again because it's still relevant.
I think some of the greatest salesmen in the world will tell you that nostalgia is a terrific mechanism for sales. Now, I'm not saying, so just some brief ideas. You're talking about 35 years ago. Where was software 35 years ago? And I think you could run with that theme and how antiquated it was and how you were there so early on. And you can play with nostalgia in that regard. And you're also then able to say you've got history, you've got longevity, there's pride and honor, and you've got a lot of content there with old stuff.
I'd like to actually chip in as well. Now, just to clarify, you're talking about marketing your business online in the question. So I would add that there's another kind of storytelling. So what I'm hearing from you is the kind of storytelling that I would call case studies or success stories. These are actual stories about us, about our business. Those can be useful and are useful. It's a testimonial. But I would say it's important to think about storytelling, to use a $10 word, holistically as well. Kind of like that example I gave about Zen habits, the guy didn't tell a story about himself. He told a story about, he wove a story where he was the guru and everyone else was the hero, right? So going back to that, there's obviously something about your software that has kept you in business for 30 years. And underneath the software, there's probably a philosophy, a way of viewing the world, a way of interacting with technology that typifies that. So I would say, enter a conversation that's already going on. Check out all the blogs that are in your space. Find out which ones are influential, and there are ways to do that. And if you want to find out, I can give you some advice on that. And there's usually only about 15. Then figure out what you, not your company, what you as a group of human beings have to say that to enter the conversation that's slightly different, not that is about your technology, but is about what underlies the technology. Leo Babauta, that Zen Habits guy, didn't talk about how his audiobooks were the best. He talked about why habit building is the best. And his audiobooks happen to be all about habit building. Does that make sense? It's a very subtle distinction, but okay. Does anyone else have a question? Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
So I'd actually like to briefly chat with you individually afterwards, more specifically, but my question now is generally we're building something that at the end of the day it's a user-generated content platform. So there's two dimensions. One is how advertisers and marketers might want to have inline content marketing, but the other is, do you have any suggestions or tips as to how to make our community of users produce better stories?
Yahoo's competitive spectrum.
Sorry?
Yahoo put out a series of articles called the competitive spectrum. And it's about understanding who your community is, who you're building for,
Right.
therefore what type of community you are building, and how to structure it so that your community can reward good content that will surface to the top.
Right.
Bad content will fall by the
So
wayside.
we're doing a lot of that.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Also, what I would recommend is don't ask too much from them. I always do the KISS method when it comes to UGC. Keep it simple, stupid. I mean, if ask them simple questions and ask them to, ask them simple tasks, and then those that, it's like the going through, the mouse in the maze, the rat in the maze. Make each level a little bit harder. Start with the very basic, and then get a little bit more involved as you go forward, and give them rewards. That's another thing, is make it rewarding for them.
I look at it from the standpoint of, with users and with people who are involved in creating things, they all have a lot of really great ideas. And I think that one of the things that we don't do enough is we don't do enough of this. Putting people in a room that are of the same mind, or that are doing the same work, to see how they can actually help each other. So if there is no way as of yet for them to meet and talk about how they can further each other's goals, you being the source for making that happen can be a great motivator to get them to do even better work and even stronger work. And many times what happens with those sort of group concepts is that the best education comes out of groups, because everybody contributes, and all of a sudden you've created this amalgamation, all this information, right? So if you get a group of users together, give them a way to communicate with each other and talk about ways to help each other, then they're going to be more motivated to create better content, because you're the person who brought them together. Everybody loves the person who throws the party.
And again, I can't keep my mouth shut, but have you thought of providing structures and blueprints to the people creating the content?
Yeah, I mean, we have that. I can tell you afterwards more.
Okay, I'd be interested. I mean, just again, I've seen two types of guidance, quote unquote, when it comes to, I don't know what your idea is, but I once had someone approach us and say, we'd like you to supervise our content creation. They basically gave me a 3-page editing sheet where to put periods and commas, right?
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is there are headline types, and they're pretty limited. There are body, the way you order a piece, and there's a limited number of them that you can hand to people, and you'll be surprised by how quickly they can generate good content, even if they're not a writer, by using this fairly limited number of structures.
Yeah.
So, which you might be doing.
Yeah, I mean, everything that you guys said is a great suggestion, and we're actually doing all of that. There's one other thing I think we're doing is we provide different user analytics so that they can actually learn how benchmark with other people to see if their stuff is being shared or being sold and somebody else is not, then they can have a look at it. But I like the idea of actually letting them converse with each other.
Yeah, that is a great idea. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, my first question goes to the gentleman, software guy.
Joseph, it's a question for
Oh,
you.
good for you.
Are you B2B or B2C?
B2B.
Okay, so now my question goes to the three of you, right? And you can't shy away, you gotta give us some meat here. So you're in a pitch, 6-month project to create stories, to create content. I mean, to penetrate this social web and get to a point where people are actually looking at your content, you have to A, create a lot of it, B, make it relevant, thoughtful, it needs to be integrated, you have to do all the research that you're all talking about, and you need to somehow get it out there, right? So what would that look like? From a 6-month plan, what would you recommend to him? What kind of
Well, how much money have you got?
Yeah.
Yeah.
recommend to him, right? Okay, let's start. What would a low end look like, and what would a high end look like?
Tier 1 marketing budget on mobile is $20,000 a month.
Okay.
Supposedly you need half a year to a year to work out across the 150 different mobile marketing networks and aggregators and sellers and exchanges where your best placements are.
And that's just advertising.
That's just advertising on mobile. That's a tier 1, so I guess that's a good client for someone like Flo.
this is skewed because I work for more smaller companies, so. So that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So
We're getting a broad.
yeah. So if we're getting, I mean, so if I were doing a digital strategy, like my flat rate for, I mean, just for writing the strategy is anywhere between $1,500 and $5,000 for the actual digital strategy itself. And then the marketing plan comes after, and that's like the digital marketing. And it can be anywhere from, you know, like a $1,200 startup to, you know, like a $10,000 startup, you know, setup fee. And then, you know, talking monthly. I mean, so it really just depends on the scope of the project. I mean, if it's a small project, then, you know, it could be low end, but it really depends on how much research I have to do, how much their content they're coming to me with. If I've got to produce all the content, then that's going to cost way more money. If they have the content already, videos, images, written content, you know, data, then they're just presenting it to me, then it's a whole nother ball game. Whereas if I have to do all the research on the back end and put everything together, then it's going to be more in depth and it's going to be more expensive. So, you know, that's the.
How much are like, I'm trying to think, I don't know, like it used to be like $10, right, to boost a post on Facebook?
Yeah, well, you can boost it, depends on who your audience is. If you are doing a boost post or if you're doing advertising, I've done successful advertising for, you know, $600. I've done successful advertising for $10,000. So it's, you know, it's just dependent upon, you know, what your budget is.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the, you know, that's definitely the main thing that you run into. I'm in a very different sort of space because I work with people individually, or I go into companies and teach them how to work with their human systems. So if I were looking at this from just a relationship standpoint, I would basically identify who are the thought leaders in your industry and then figure out who are the people who are considered the mavens in that industry. Who are the people that people are reading their blog posts, people are reading their content, and then figure out how you can get your material on their platform. And in many cases, the biggest thing with people with platforms, when I worked at the educational technology startup, in about a day, I got us an interview with USA Today. And it was through Twitter. And it was basically, I looked up who was writing the post, I commented on that person's post, they responded, we got in touch, and we just talked about what this person was passionate about, and then figured out a way to hop on the phone, told them that we had something relevant, and it moved from there.
But that's luck of the draw.
Yeah.
I mean, that was lucky.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you're doing like hardcore outreach and you're doing real research, you know, I mean, I've built relationships with, you know, with Huffington Post, with Current TV, with, you know, I have, you know, journalists across the city that I built relationships with, but some of them have happened overnight. Some of them have taken weeks or months for me to build relationships with. So, and again, it's learning, you know, how deep does your research go? How much time do you have? And time is money. So, you know, who do you want?
Yeah, and who are you also going for? Because it could take you 6 months to get in front of the person with that platform, but it could also take you a very short period of time. It's at the heart of it, it's what do people need? Like, the fact of the matter is, every single person that you meet, I don't care how successful they are, I don't care how powerful they are, they have 3 things they're concerned with: time, connections, and money. You find a deficit in one of those 3 things and you fill that deficit, people will remember you for the rest of their life. That's just the way that's just the way it works.
Anyone have a question else? All right, everyone. Well, thanks for coming. Great questions. Great.
Thank you for coming.